Hi there, welcome back to Busch History. I am David Busch and this is topic 20 in Busch History World. We are talking about the Great Depression today. It's important when taking a look at the Great Depression to understand the time period we're talking about. The Great Depression begins it's October 1929 and continues through largely until 1941. So you have 12 years. That's effectively known as the Great Depression. We use October 29th as the beginning because that's the stock market crash and the economy collapses. And we use 1941 as the end because as we're gearing up for World War II, we get full employment in the United States because everybody that can work will work. The definition of depression is an interesting one. It varies in time throughout American history. There's a recession and there's a depression. A friend of mine has a joke is a recession is when your neighbor lost his job and a depression is when you lost your job. But suffice it to say, the difference between recession and depression is the severity and the length. It used to be the amount of cycles or quarters or months that the economy was in decline. Regardless of how we measure it, it's a continuing decline in gross national product. We now call gross national product gross domestic product, and there are different things included in the measurement than there was back in the 1920s. But nevertheless, it's a steady decline in output in the United States connected with a rising unemployment rate. And during the Depression in 1933, we hit a 25% unemployment rate in the United States, which is absolutely incredible. During the recent recession, the recession of 2008 forward, we hit an unemployment rate between 9 and a little over 10, depending on where you measure in the United States. So during the Great Depression, the unemployment rate was 2.5 times greater than it was in recent days after the 2008 recession. And it bears taking a look, once again, just briefly, at some of the causes and the victims in the Great Depression. So let me cue up a slide for you and I will be right back. You may recall our cast of characters in the last presentation, presentation 19. Each one of these characters represented an element of American society during the 1920s. We had James Byam. He was using credit poorly and too much borrowing, and there were millions of them. Harold Bildit was a producer. He was a factory owner. He was overproducing. If you overproduce, you drive prices down, and there were millions of Harold Bildits. Emma Savitz, people who were putting money in the bank, well, they're fueling the credit that Lendits is providing. Emma's putting money in the bank by the millions, and Lendits is lending money out. And he also is part of millions of people that are doing this in banks called loan officers, and he's paid by commission. I'm a Sucker is one of the people borrowing money, not like Harold borrowed money for a hard good or for a factory, and not like James who borrowed money to purchase things for his home, but Ima was borrowing money to purchase stocks, and she didn't understand what she was doing. And because she didn't understand what she was doing, she was being very reckless about it. And there were millions of people doing that as well. And then we have Zeke. Zeke is the agriculture version of Harold. Zeke is overproducing because he borrowed money from Len. He needs to pay the money back that he borrowed to Len, and the only way he knows to get that money is to keep selling things. So as he produces more, hopefully to sell at a higher price, in reality, prices continue to drop. Now, we go to our buddy Bent here. Bent represents about 61% of American society. These are unskilled workers. Unskilled workers are highly susceptible to swings in business cycles. When a business starts not doing that well, one of the things it does is lays off its workers. When a business wants to change or be bought or sold, one thing it does is it changes workers. So Bent is very disposable in society, and he'll be the first person that's going to be impacted by this. So the stock market crashes. Stock market is like ringing the bell, ching, 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 that the economy is falling apart. And the reason why the stock market crashes is people start doing something called profit taking. Stocks have gone up and up and up, and the people who had made a lot of money, paper money mind you, because you don't make money on stocks until you sell them. So people who made money started to sell their stocks. Now when they started to sell their stocks to take their profit, they essentially had done what Zeke had done. By buying and buying and buying and buying, they created a demand for something, and now all of a sudden they're going to start to sell. And when they sell, they're going to flood the market with securities that are for sale. And when that happens, the price is going to start to drop. Well, when the price starts to drop and the businesses are starting to get concerned about this and the banks starting to get concerned about this, what the banks start to do is they start to buy securities. They buy securities, they buy stocks. Lens Bank, instead of lending money to people to buy stock, Lens Bank actually starts buying the stock. And what that does is that temporarily bolsters the stock price and they come back up again. But what happens here? People still want to do profit taking. So they're going to start selling their stocks again. And when they start to sell their stocks, the prices are going to start to drop. And the banks have now run out of money. They can no longer support the stock prices by buying, and the banks own these securities, these stock certificates, as the prices start to fall. So what happens next? Well, Lenditz does something called a margin call. Lenditz starts calling the people who bought securities. And what he does is he calls IMA and says, IMA, you have to repay some of this money. And IMA says, I'm sorry, I don't have the money. Remember, these were 90% loans. So once IMA's stock had dropped 10%, she no longer is interested in this. Because the way she looks at it, that money is now lost. And any more money to be lost will be lost by the banks. Not only that, IMA may have just lost her job and is unable to repay that margin call. She might have lost her job because she might have worked for Harold. Don't know this for sure, but there are people who work for Harold. I'm sure that own securities. So she might have worked for Harold, and Harold is unable to sell his products, we know, and eventually he's going to have to lay people off. So this downward spiral starts. The banks can't support it anymore. The people who are on margin, who bought stocks on margin, are not paying their loans. Lenditz is on the phone like crazy. So who does he go to next? He goes to the secured loans. The secured loans are the people like Harold and Zeke. Harold and Zeke. Harold and Zeke, each one of them had pledged something for the money they had borrowed from Len. Zeke had pledged his farm, and Harold had pledged his factory. So, in order to get money to pay back Len, Zeke is going to end up selling his farm, Harold is going to end up selling his factory, or the bank is going to take the farm and take the factory. In either case, the bank is not a farmer and the bank is not a producer of anything. The bank lends money. That's how banks exist. So, the farm is going to stop producing and the factory is going to stop producing, whether they have to sell it to pay the loan or whether the banks do something called foreclosing on a loan. In either case, they're going to stop producing, and all of the Harolds across the United States are going to have to lay off all of their workers, and we start the unemployment cycle. And there's still no money in the banks. There's still no money in the banks, and what happens during a depression is there's a deflation. Prices drop because there's no money to support purchasing. So the fewer people that can purchase because of unemployment, because they're now losing their jobs, they can't support higher prices, and prices start to drop. So the businesses who had been vying on the idea that price will continue to rise and high profits, they can't pay back their loans either. So you have this downward spiral, and it goes lower and lower. And what really happens during a depression is there's a lack of money. A lack of money to pay back the debts that had been incurred. So there's a deflation. It's kind of like, I use the metaphor of a river. Money is a river. And the river needs to keep flowing to irrigate the land around it and to carry the commerce that's on it. Well, what happens is, If the money dries up like the river dries up, the boats come to rest on the bottom, and businesses stop moving their products around because no one's buying them. And the irrigation on the sides of the river, the people like the Emmas and the James, they lose their jobs because there's no money to irrigate them. There's no money to pay them. So the spiral continues downward and downward and downward. And pretty soon, you have an unemployment rate that is pushing 25% in 1933. So what do we do about this? How does this get solved? Let me cue up a PowerPoint and we're going to talk about this a little bit. Be right back. When the Depression begins in October of 1929, the president is Herbert Hoover. He is the third of the three Republican presidents during the 1920s, during the Roaring Twenties. And each of them had adopted the philosophy of stay out of business. Business will handle the business of running the government and running the country. They will be successful, and we need a minimalist government. It is a very Republican point of view. Less government, more people involved. And during the 1920s, those people were mostly the wealthy investors who were making a lot of money. But in October of 1929, it all comes down. It all falls apart. Unemployment starts to rise, money dries up in society, and now what do we do? And the question becomes, what is the role of government? Does government intervene? And if government does intervene, what does government do? Who does government support? Does government support the entire economy, or does government support business in the economy, hoping to get the economy started again? Let's take a look, and we can get an idea of the differing points of view. Again, the debate is, what shall government do? Is it government's job to get involved in this? Or should the business cycles just be allowed to continue and eventually the economy will improve? Let's see if we can figure this out together. This is topic 20, the Great Depression in Bush History Land, and if you recall, everything that I show you is available on my website, www.bushhistory.net, and there's a brief description of everything on the website, and there are folders that have most of the information that you're seeing here available to you, as well as some additional information. And as always, any questions, please email me. You go to bushhistory.net and you will find the email address. The email address, by the way, is bushhistory@gmail.com. And I have gotten several emails, and I answer them as best I can. And if you don't like the answers, I'm sorry, and respond to me, and I'll give you some more information. Let's get going. This is called a Hoover Hotel in 1931. And this is called a Hooverville in 1931. It was a joke about President Hoover that he wasn't doing anything. A Hoover Hotel was a shack. A Hooverville was a collection of shacks. And they were made out of cardboard or corrugated metal or anything people could find because homelessness was rising due to unemployment. And President Hoover wasn't sure what to do about this. He debated getting involved and how we would get involved, and he came up with something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And that Reconstruction Finance Corporation was an attempt to aid business so the country could get back on its feet again. And let's briefly take a look at how that works. This was President Hoover's plan. It's called trickle-down economics. And it's very simple and it's very logical. And it goes like this. The government is going to loan money to business to be repaid, because the government's not in the business of just lending money and not getting it back. The government's going to loan money to business. Business owners are going to take that money and they're going to invest in their plants and their factories. So they're going to improve, they're going to modernize, they're going to enlarge their plants and their factories. Well, that's going to require workers, hence impact on unemployment. As it creates new jobs, those workers are going to increase production. They're going to start to make stuff. They made a bigger factory, now they're going to start to make stuff to sell. As they increase production and they earn money by increasing production, there are going to be more wages in circulation, so more people are going to have money, and if more people have money, demand will increase. It's very logical. It's very logical, and it's highly flawed, because what was found to be the case were two big problems. First of all, While the businesses were interested in taking the loans, they were not interested in expanding their plants. They were more interested in repaying their loans. And you have to think about that for a second. If you're a business owner and you're heavily in debt, Harold Bildin, say Harold Bildin is hanging on by his fingernails, and all of a sudden he gets a low-interest loan from the government. Harold is going to repay the loan before he increases production and before he hires more workers. Because after all, overproduction got him into trouble in the first place. So the idea that he's going to hire new workers and that's going to put more wage in circulation is flawed. In reality, I'm sure some businesses did, but in a whole, you can't produce goods when people aren't buying goods. That would be a bad business decision. But that was Hoover's approach. It was a minimalist approach. Let's deal with the people at the top and they will kind of kickstart the economy. People weren't going for it. This became known as pump priming. When Franklin Roosevelt was running for president, he said, no, this is my idea. Instead of starting with business, we're going to start on the bottom. We're going to start with people who are unemployed. So the first thing he does, he's going to have his good friend Harry Hopkins go around and oversee the distribution of money in the United States. There are going to be relief payments and temporary jobs on government projects. So we're going to give people money. And they go around the major cities of the United States and they're going to hand out money to homeless people. And they're going to hire people for temporary government jobs. It doesn't matter what the job is. We're going to hire them. They're going to clean parks. They're going to paint walls. They're going to do things like that. But we're going to get them working again. What that's going to do is that's going to put more money in circulation. Now people are working. They have money. If they have money, that's going to increase demand. And when demand increases, that's going to cause businesses to increase investment in their factories and in their buildings. And when they do that, they're going to expand their plants. And when they expand their plants, they're going to create new jobs. So now you have more people working. And more people working is going to generate more profits as they produce more goods for the businesses. And the businesses are going to win here. So the two ideas are exactly the opposite of each other. Trickle down. Start a business on the top. Put money into business. Business is going to create jobs through increased production. Pump priming, you start on the bottom. You give the poorest people money so they can go out and start to buy things. And that's going to increase demands, stimulating production. And then businesses will do better that way. And if you take a look, here they are side by side. Hoover's trickle down, starting with government loans to businesses, and hopefully that will increase plant expansion and create more jobs and increase production. And you have Roosevelt's plan of, let's start with priming the pump at the bottom. It was an expression used back in the days when people had the pump on the front lawn of their house and they didn't have indoor plumbing. And before you could get water coming out of that pump, you had to push the handle several times. It created a suction and the water would come out of the pump. Well, that's what he's doing. The suction is relief payments. Money, just giving out money to people who are unemployed. Very different points of view. But if you think about it just for a second, which one is going to work faster? Not best in the long run, faster. Because best is really open for debate. This works faster. Roosevelt believed that there were 3 R's to solving the Depression: relief, recovery, and reform. And I'll show you a slide about that in a few minutes. You have to relieve the suffering. Pump priming relieves the suffering. They go around and start handing out money in the major cities. You have to recover the economy. You have to create lasting jobs. Relief, recovery. You have to create lasting jobs, and reform. You have to reform the economy. You have to make sure that the underlying problems that were caused by Lenditz and company in the 1920s can never happen again. And the New Deal, which is Franklin Roosevelt's plan, sought to do all 3 of those things. This is the labor force between 1929 and 1941. It's in millions, so you have to add 6 zeros onto the information up here. In the first column you have the year, and the second column you have the amount of people working. For example, this is not 49.2, it's 49.2 million workers. So this is 49 million workers, and this is 55.9 million workers. Number unemployed, again, you have to add 6 zeros. This isn't 1.6 people in 1929, it's 1.6 million. And then at the end, in 1941, it's 5.6 million, just to give you an idea. And this is the percentage unemployed. We're not adding zeros here. 3.2%, 8.7%, 15.9%. If you take a look at these numbers, 1929, I like to use percent unemployed because that is the clearest picture. In 1929, 3.2% of the people in the United States are unemployed. Economists like to use the number of between 4 and 6% unemployed as a strong, healthy economy. Because there are a certain amount of people at any given time who are going to be unemployed in the strongest of economies. Whether they be seasonal workers, whether it be people choosing not to work, or whether it be people simply between jobs. So nevertheless, in 1929, the unemployment rate is 3.2%. But look what happens very quickly. In 1930, because October 29 is when the stock market crashes, in 1930, the unemployment rate jumps to 8.7%. It more than doubles in a year, which is incredible. In 1931, it pretty much doubles again to 15.9%. That is an unbelievable rise. Now remember, the more people unemployed, the less people purchasing. The less people purchasing, the less money business makes. The less money business makes, the more they have to lay people off, and the more people unemployed. In 1932, we had 23.6%, and people going, my God, that's almost a quarter of the population are unemployed. And what is President Hoover doing about it? And they're not very happy because they don't think he's doing enough. And in 1933, the height of the Great Depression, we hit a high point of 24.9% of the population. A quarter of the population is unemployed. Now remember, during the recent recession, the recession of 2008 and 9, we hit a high of a little over 10% nationally. So this is 25%, 24.9%, a quarter of the population is unemployed. How bad are things? Things are really bad. So if we're going to measure the severity of the Depression by unemployment, Franklin Roosevelt becomes president in 1933 with a quarter of the people out of work. We kick into his New Deal, his ideas to reform the economy. Well, in 1934, unemployment drops to 21.7%. In 1935, it drops to 20%. In 1936, it drops to 16.9%, and so on. So, at very simple logic, you would say government involvement is dropping unemployment. Unemployment is falling. There are other factors to consider, but that would be a statement that you could draw, and a conclusion that you could make in this particular situation is that things are working. However, now we're going to hit 1938, and unemployment jumps up again to 19%. You say, wait a minute, if these Roosevelt plans are working so well, why is unemployment rising? Well, because in 1937 to 1938, some of the plans are pulled back upon. Some of the government assistance is removed, and this is called the Roosevelt recession. Because if there's less government involvement, unemployment is going to rise, and the economy is still a bit fragile in this particular case. So, Roosevelt turns on the burners again. In 1939, unemployment starts to drop. It drops again in 1940, and in 1941, it drops again. People say that while government action was necessary, it did not end the Great Depression. That World War II ended the Great Depression, because in the waning years before we enter World War II, the United States economy is gearing up by supplying Europe. Well, World War II breaks out in 1939. So if that's the case, there's a certain logic to this. Another number I want to point out to you is the increasing people in the labor force. Now, why would the labor force be increasing? Well, the labor force is considered to be people who are of the age to work. And as society is growing older in this time, we're going to have more people entering the labor force, more people looking for jobs. And the number unemployed is absolutely staggering. If you take a look at 1933, which is the worst year for the Depression,
12.8 million people unemployed in the United States. 12.8 million, about a quarter of the labor force. So things were really bad. And the question is, if you don't believe that the government should intervene in a situation like this, what should the government do? And that's the argument. The argument is, should the government just let it go and eventually it will solve itself? Well, that argument works if you are not suffering. But if you're suffering, you want government intervention. So let's go a little further here. These people were suffering. These are people on a bread line, or they're online to get a job or to get some basic supplies. And one of the interesting things about that time period is, even when people were looking for some kind of assistance, they always dressed completely. Yes, they're a little disheveled looking, they've been out of work for a while, but these guys are wearing suits. They're wearing suits to go get handouts. It was not something that they wanted. This wasn't something like they figured they were entitled to, because there were no entitlement programs like we think of today. This was an unusual thing to get handouts. And they're lining up there because they want to somehow get something to bring home to their families. While Franklin Roosevelt was trying to solve the Great Depression during the New Deal, there were challenges to his plans and his ideas. As I said, I'm going to take a look at the specific programs with you after I'm done with this PowerPoint. But one of the challenges was Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States, 1933 to 1935. I have two dates up there because 33 is when the case first comes to court and 35 is when it's decided. Without going into the smaller details right now, the question was, how much control does the government have in regulating trade? And the Supreme Court ruled that the government, federal government, cannot regulate intra-state trade, trade within a state. And all of the programs that dealt with anything to do with intrastate trade were now unconstitutional. And what that really hit upon was a program called the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, as it was called, a very popular program. NIRA set minimum wages, NIRA set workplace standards, and NIRA regulated how businesses operated within a state as well as outside of the state in terms of pricing. Well, Supreme Court ruled that was way too much power for the federal government, and NIRA was declared unconstitutional. Another case, United States versus Butler, the same exact years. This had to do with the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, and some of these programs, by the way, were called alphabet soup because you could break them down to their letters as opposed to their names. Anyway, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, was overseeing farm production and distribution of taxes in the United States. And specifically, in this particular case, money was being used from canners to support farmers. Tax money from canners, food processors, was being given over to subsidize farmers. And the federal government said, excuse me, the Supreme Court said, you can't do that. You cannot take money from one group of people and apply it directly to another group of people. It's favoritism, and it's, again, too much power for the federal government to have. So the AAA was struck down. So you're Franklin Roosevelt now, what do? Franklin Roosevelt says, there's something wrong with the Supreme Court. We need to fix it. I know, there's too many old people on the Supreme Court. So he comes up with this idea, it's called court packing. Of course, he doesn't call it court packing. He calls it restructuring. We have to restructure the Supreme Court. If you're over 70 years old, you're too old to work that hard. So he wants to appoint a new judge for every judge that's over 70 years old. Not an assistant judge, a full-blown judge. And they'll participate in decision-making as well. And he also wants judges who are over 70 to begin the retirement process. So he wants to get rid of them. Well, what he's really going to do here, if he's successful, is he's going to appoint the judges that are more favorable to his programs in the New Deal, and he's not going to have any more problems with the Supreme Court. Well, there's a huge public backlash to this, looking like Franklin Roosevelt is becoming too much of a dictator. And he backs down. He backs down, but what also occurs is the Supreme Court seems to adjust itself a little bit. And the next case that comes before them is the National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Corporation in 1937. This case isn't really structurally different from the other cases, and it's a case about a lot of power from the federal government. As I said, I'll explain the details in a few minutes, but in this particular case, the Supreme Court rules for the federal government. So, did Roosevelt scare the Supreme Court? Maybe, we don't know that. But Roosevelt was not going to take the Supreme Court striking his different programs down and just do nothing about it. So, Schechter Poultry, United States versus Butler, both of those cases struck down by the Supreme Court. Those programs struck down by the Supreme Court. Court packing was the result. Court changed his attitude. National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin Steel. The federal government wins that one. Was Roosevelt successful? You decide. Just kind of going through the events here. Now I have some things called FDRisms. These are terms unique to FDR and the New Deal. First of all, we have the New Deal. When he's running for president, he says, American public deserves a New Deal, and I'm going to give it to you. He wins by a landslide. So we have the first 100 days. The first 100 days, they become the barometer for how well he is doing. And unfortunately, every president after him is measured on those first 100 days. It goes from March 9th to June 6, 1933, and it is a flurry of programs and legislative achievements. He does not let Congress go home, and they keep passing one bill after another to try to intervene in the economy, get the economy back on its feet. The 3 R's I mentioned a few minutes ago: relief, recovery, and reform. The 3 goals of the federal government, if you like. Relief, to relieve the suffering of the masses, get people back on their feet again. Recovery is to make the economy better, fix the economy. And reform is to make sure it never happens again. I'll go through examples of the programs for those 3 things. The bank holiday. Shortly after Roosevelt is inaugurated, he orders, through executive order, the closing of every bank in the United States. He wants to stop the bleeding. Remember, the people like Emma Savit, they go to the banks and they try to get out whatever money they can. And during that time, even the healthy banks were going to start to suffer, because a bank is a lending institution. It's a store for lending money. Well, it needs a supply of money to lend. And the bank holiday shuts down the banks, so people stop taking money out of the banks. And during that time, the banks are going to be audited and they are going to be examined. And the healthy banks are going to be allowed to reopen. Healthy banks are defined as banks that have enough funds to meet the demands of their depositors. So they have enough money to pay their depositors. The second New Deal, it's on the heels of the first New Deal. It's the second wave of programs. The first New Deal dealt primarily with relief. The second New Deal deals primarily with recovery. Alphabet soup was the term used to describe the New Deal programs. There was the TVA, there was the AAA, there was the PWA, there was the WPA, there was the CCC. All of these programs they were longer, they had longer names that were shortened so people knew what they were talking about very quickly. Court packing, as I explained in the previous slide, was FDR's attempt to control the Supreme Court, and the Roosevelt recession occurs in 1937, 1938, when some of the New Deal programs are scaled back. So this is a collection of FDRisms. And this is what those FDRisms are trying to combat. These people were called Okies. They were leaving Oklahoma to go to California. These are the Zeke Pefferleys. These are the hereditary farmers who no longer have the ability to farm. And you see that the farmland is not looking really good. These are people lined up in major cities looking for jobs. It says Empire State Employment Agency. It's a little difficult to see in the large slide. You'll be able to see this in the slide you download. And there are so many people looking for so few jobs. And of course, wages were very low as well, because lack of money during the Depression and too many people looking for jobs meant that wages could be very low. One of the interesting things that happens is, this is a slaughtered pig. North Carolina was the pork capital of the United States. And just like agricultural products have been overproduced, pigs have been overproduced. There were too many pigs, and the price of pork kept dropping and dropping. So Roosevelt ordered the slaughter of millions of pigs in North Carolina to try to bring up pork prices. And people were outraged, said, how can you do that? There are people starving and you're killing the pigs. And Roosevelt said, we need to bring up pork prices so the pork farmers can stay in business. Very controversial. take a look, you have a for sale sign, you have a house in a very rundown area. This could be Zeke's house. This could be Zeke's house. It could be anybody's house. But the fact is, people were simply walking away from their homes because they couldn't pay their bills. This was called a duster. In the middle of the Depression, with this 7-year drought, it stops raining. It stops raining in the central part of the United States, in the breadbasket of the United States, Nebraska and the like, Nebraska and Kansas and the like. And as it stops raining and the ground dries up, and then the winds pick up, they cause these tremendous dust storms. See, one of the things that had occurred during the late 19th century was the traditional grass that had been used on the plains, that had grown for centuries through Mother Nature, very deep roots. Well, that grass was turned over, went under the plow to make for growing land for agricultural production. And when that grass had been turned over, those roots that had held the soil in place for years had now disappeared. And during the Dust Bowl, during the drought of the mid-1930s, that soil turned to dust, and when the wind came, it just blew the dust. There's another picture of a dust storm. It was probably an incredible sight to see up close. They called them the dusters, and people hid inside their houses to stay out of the dust. You couldn't breathe during those storms, and without rain, those storms would simply continue. As a result of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, we still have some programs in our lives today. I'm going to take a look at these programs separately, but just to give you an idea, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, was instituted to protect the Emma Savers. The Emma Savers were going to lose their monies as the bank went out of business. The FDIC protects depositors' money today up to $250,000. If your bank goes out of business today, the federal government will reimburse your money up to $250,000 per account. So it has to be in separate accounts. Social Security still exists today, again for the Emma Savers, for the people who are at retirement age, so they can stop working and at least have a sustainable level of comfort in life so they can meet their daily expenses. Also for people who are disabled. The Indian Reorganization Act. The Indian Reorganization Act put Indians back on their ancestral lands, on their reservations, and the government would support those reservations to an extent with a certain amount of money. We still have minimum wage laws in effect today. A business cannot pay you less than a minimum wage. A couple of exceptions to that is there is a separate minimum wage for hospitality workers, people like waiters and people like maids and things like that, because they also get a good deal of their income from tips. I never thought that was fair, by the way. I always thought, I still think that hospitality workers should be paid a minimum wage as well. And if they get tips, they get tips. We shouldn't rely on someone else to support that business. The business should pay the workers the wages. The Tennessee Valley Authority. Tennessee Valley Authority was a power authority that was built throughout the Tennessee Valley, which is one of the poorest part of the United States, where they built a series of dams to provide hydroelectric power. And just think of the amount of jobs created by building those dams and servicing the hydroelectric power plants. And in that area today, we still have hydroelectric power. The Securities and Exchange Commission. Securities and Exchange Commission regulates stock trades, regulates how stocks are traded, and says that banks cannot purchase stocks, which is one of the things that happened with Len Ditz. Went a little awry recently, because some of these regulations were relaxed during the waning years of the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. And the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, is still in place today, and this protects workers' rights and collective bargaining. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'm going to take a closer look at pivotal Supreme Court cases during Roosevelt's tenure in office, during the New Deal. And the first one is Schechter Poultry Corporation versus the United States. And it begins in 1933, and it's not going to be decided until 1935. And what that had to do with, a company called Schechter Poultry, which is based in Brooklyn, was selling sick chickens, it's called a sick chicken case, to a butcher. And all of this was occurring within Brooklyn. It was occurring intra-state. And the butcher brought suit against Schechter Poultry for selling these chickens, and the federal government penalized Schechter Poultry. Well, Schechter Poultry turned around and sued the federal government, basically saying that the federal government does not have the ability to regulate intrastate commerce. The case quickly shifted away from sick chickens, because it really isn't about sick chickens anymore then. It's about the power of the federal government. Something called the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, as it was called, a very, very popular New Deal program. So popular that some people named their children Ira or Naira after women were named Naira and boys were named Ira. Anyway, so popular because it regulated the workplace. It regulated work hours, it regulated wages, it regulated prices. It was a very large government, very socialized program. Anyway, as a result of getting involved with Schechter Poultry, there was a backlash, and Schechter Poultry sued the United States government, hence Schechter Poultry versus the United States government. And the Supreme Court turned around and said, you know what, Schechter Poultry, you have a point. The sick chicken's a bad idea, but who should have policed that? Should that have been the state of New York, or should it have been the federal government? And the Supreme Court turned around and said, that is a case for the state of New York and not the federal government, and struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, struck down NIRA in 1935. And as a result of that, President Roosevelt's really pissed now. He says, what are you talking about? This is a great program. It doesn't matter whether it's a good program or not. It matters that it was an overreach by the federal government. So that is the first significant challenge to the New Deal by business, because Schechter Poultry is business. Remember, business isn't really loving the New Deal, because the programs that are coming forth in the New Deal, they're coming from taxes on the big businesses that are still in business. Let's take a look now at the next case. And this is United States versus Butler. Once again, begins in 1933, decided in 1935. And United States versus Butler is different and the same. Both having to do with power of the United States government, but this is a different use of it. Suit was brought by Butler in an attempt to have the Agricultural Adjustment Act declared unconstitutional. What was happening was the federal government had imposed a tax on food producers. Think of them as canners, Del Monte, Heinz, people like that, people putting food in cans. They were charging these canners a tax. Okay, federal government has the ability to tax, but they were taking those tax dollars and giving them directly to farmers in the role of a subsidy, subsidizing the Zeeks, taking money from the canners and giving money to the Zeeks, to the farmers. Well, this seemed like a huge overreach again, because it was a tax on one specific group of people to benefit another specific group of people. Supreme Court turned around and said, you can't do that. That's too much power for the federal government. You can't tax one group of people and directly use that money to benefit another group of people. So the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, the AAA, was declared unconstitutional as well. So this is blow one and blow two to the New Deal. And as stated, that was going to spur Franklin Roosevelt forward with the idea of what can we do to adjust the Supreme Court. Here we have the third case of the three major challenges to the Supreme Court. This is National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin Steel. What had happened here was Jones and Laughlin Steel had fired some workers because they belonged to a union. In a proceeding under the National Labor Relations Act of 1935, the National Labor Relations Board found that Jones and Laughlin Steel Corporation had violated the act by firing 10 union members because of their union membership. Now remember, when a case goes to the Supreme Court, the person who's being sued was the winner in the lower court, and the person who is suing, the plaintiff and the defendant, the person who is suing is the loser in the lower court. So the NLRB had lost in the Court of Appeals, and that's how we get to the Supreme Court. And the issue was whether the United States Congress involvement in labor relations went beyond its means to regulate interstate commerce. In other words, can the United States Congress tell a business it cannot fire its workers for their union membership? Now the Supreme Court gets involved and says, yep, it can do that. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled 5-4, so it's a close decision, in favor of the National Labor Relations Board, stating that Congress has the ability to regulate intrastate matters when they directly burden, threaten, or obstruct interstate commerce. So it's like a reversal of Schechter Poultry here. And that reversal occurs after the court packing debacle. So is the Supreme Court running scared at this time? Scared of what Franklin Roosevelt might do? Some people say yes, that that's exactly what occurred. But nevertheless, it's interesting to take a look that there was significant backlash to the New Deal. Some of it won, and some of it not won. Here's a brief look at the court packing scenario. I'm not going to go into all the small details. These notes are going to be on the website for you. But let's take a look. This is March 9th, 1937. And this is during one of Roosevelt's fireside chats. He had these weekly radio programs. And people sit around and listen to the programs. They call them fireside chats because people sat around the fireplace. This is what he said. He said, the balance of power has been tipped out of balance by the courts in direct contradiction of the high purposes of the framers of the Constitution. It is my purpose to restore that. This is how he is justifying trying to take the Supreme Court and put more people on the courts to balance out the people he believes are behaving unjustly. And then this is Justice Louis Brandeis about NYRA and about the President's power. This is the end of this business centralization. And I want you to go back and tell the President that we're not going to let this government centralize everything. It's come to an end. This is Justice Louis Brandeis commenting on the National Industrial Recovery Act. So there are the battle lines. There's Roosevelt saying the Supreme Court can't undo what the framers of the Constitution wanted, which was the government helping people. And there's Justice Louis Brandeis saying this is an end to business centralization in the United States and the government needs to back down. So those are the battle lines. And as I said, this court of public opinion at Roosevelt's attempt to pack the court has Roosevelt back down, and as a result of his attempt to back the court seems to change its point of view when we get to Jones Steel. If you take a look, there are extensive notes here, and you can read these on your own. Here's a cartoon that was popular of the day. It shows FDR with his cane walking up the steps of government reorganization to Supreme Court revision to dictator. One of the examples I like to use from time to time is Franklin Roosevelt rose to power in 1933 during the height of economic chaos in his country. He turned around, he centralized a lot of business regulations in his government for what he thought was to benefit the people, and he took a lot of power into his hands and made the federal government much stronger. As a result of that, the economy of his country improved, and in 1945, Franklin Roosevelt died. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in a country whose economy was in shambles. He centralized the powers of government under his control, seeking to benefit the economy of his nation, and he did improve the economy of his nation by using all kinds of dictatorial means and practices. And Franklin Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler both died in 1945. There's an old movie I can't find anymore. It's called The Democrat and the Dictator, and it compares the two. No, Franklin Roosevelt is not Adolf Hitler, and Adolf Hitler is not Franklin Roosevelt. That's not the point. The point is that there was significant retaliation against Franklin Roosevelt for what appeared to be him taking a lot of power in his hands to try to centralize the government and control business in the United States. Hence, this reaction to it, this cartoon, step by step. And of course, remember, Franklin Roosevelt didn't walk very well. Franklin Roosevelt was stricken by polio. So it's an interesting look at Roosevelt during his New Deal and during his alphabet soup of programs. Here we have a collection of New Deal programs. It's a very long list. It says successes and failures of Roosevelt's New Deal programs. If you just bear with me and take a look as I scroll down through these. There's program after program after program after program. And this list, by the way, is going to be available on the website in the Topic 20 folder for the New Deal and for the Great Depression. There's three columns: the program, the description, and the outcome. I've left the outcome blank, so you can think about what the outcome would be. But think in terms of, is it a relief program? Is it a recovery program? Is it a reform program? Relief is immediate. Recovery fixes the problem, and a reform program has a long-term effect and makes sure that the problem, whatever it was, cannot come back. So let's take a look. 1933, the Emergency Banking Act. On March 6, 1933, he shut down all of the banks. This is the bank holiday. And forced Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Act. This act gave the government opportunity to inspect the health of all banks. Think about this: relief, recovery, or reform. Which one would that be? You decide. Also in 1933, the Glass-Steagall Act. This act set up the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Bank deposits were insured up to $5,000. Now deposits are insured up to $100,000 per account, and most recently they've gone to $250,000. A lasting program, so relief, recovery, or reform. When you go to the bank today, you will see this seal. If you have a savings and loan or credit union, you say FSLIC, Federal Savings and Loan Insurance Corporation. Same idea. Emma Savitt cannot lose her money anymore as a result of the Glass-Steagall Act. Now we have FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This was giving out money. Led by Harry Hopkins, a former social worker, this agency sent funds to local relief agencies. Within 2 hours, $5 million was given out. Mr. Hopkins believed that men should be put to work and not be given charity. His program also funded public work programs. And one of the very interesting things they found out was when this money was given out, you know what people did with it? In most cases, they didn't buy food. They bought clothing so they could go for job interviews. The sense that the government would give you did not exist. This government handout idea was not there yet. There was a feeling that if you hand out things, that people will lose their ability or desire to work. There's a story about a man, a fisherman, and he's got a proverb. He says, "Give a man a fish, he eats today. Teach a man to fish, he eats forever." The people who were against these programs thought that giving fish out was a bad idea. Anyway, now we get to the Civil Works Administration. This public work program gave the unemployed jobs building and repairing roads, parks, airports, etc. Important infrastructure jobs were given to workers to help rebuild the infrastructure, at the same time putting them to work and putting money into the economy. There was something called Keynesian economics, or Keynesian economics, John Maynard Keynes. It's about deficit spending. That if the government spends a little money by borrowing and they stimulate the economy, they make more back through those workers paying tax dollars. A huge program, Civilian Conservation Corps, 1933. This environmental program put 2.5 million unmarried men to work maintaining and restoring forests, beaches, and parks. The interesting thing about the CCC, Civilian Conservation Program, it was for unmarried men under 25 years old, and they'd be taken out of the cities. They'd be taken out of the cities and put in work camps. And then they'd go around planting trees and building stone walls in the middle of national parks and cleaning up creek beds and things like that. And their money that they made was sent home to their family. It was almost like going into the military, except you were now working restoring parts of the environment. It took the group that was most likely to turn to crime, unemployed young men, off the streets of cities and gave them jobs. Yes, they would make work jobs, no doubt about it. But what did it do? It helped solve crime, because eventually people who are hungry turn to stealing. Even the most honest people, if they have to eat, are going to turn to stealing. And it took homelessness away from the cities, because these people are most likely to be homeless. Gave them a place to live, it gave them some place to work, and it took money and sent it back to their family. Very, very successful program. The Indian Reorganization Act, the Howard Wheeler Act, it reversed the Dawes Act. It reversed the Dawes Act in that now Indians can live, or Native Americans can live with their cultures on their tribes, restored certain tribal lands. Very controversial program, because what it also did was it took the millions of Indians that were unemployed, putting them on their reservations, and now that reservation was considered sovereign land. And the unemployed Native Americans were no longer counted in the unemployment numbers. So it was like jimmying the numbers as well. NIRA was incredibly far-reaching, National Industrial Recovery Act. It regulated the workplace. It regulated minimum wages. It regulated work hours, working conditions, and production quotas. Very, very far-reaching, very popular program. But that's the one that Schechter is going to get declared unconstitutional in the sick chicken case. The PWA, the Public Works Administration, they're going to build dams on the Columbia River. Again, lots of labor jobs for men. Federal Securities Act, 1933, basically puts lend-its out of business. Says that banks cannot purchase stocks. This act required full disclosure of information on stocks being sold. It set up the SEC, which regulated the stock market and set new guidelines for stock and securities investments. So you got to tell people these things are risky. Banks cannot buy stocks. And let's watch how they're doing it and set margin rates at 50%, not 10%. Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, in order to help people keep their houses, the whole refinance mortgages. So people who had these high mortgages and couldn't pay those mortgage payments anymore, the federal government stepped in and would help adjust the payments for them. Very similar to what's been going on recently during the housing crisis, the federal government trying to get more involved. This one was a lot more successful. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, this is the one that's set aside by the Supreme Court as well. The AAA tries to raise farm prices by using tax dollars to subsidize farmers. It's going to be declared unconstitutional, but it's going to be replaced by the Department of Agriculture. The Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA. The TVA helped farmers and created jobs in one of the poorest parts of the United States, the Tennessee Valley. It also brought them electricity. They didn't have electricity, and the TVA built dams on the Tennessee River and provided hydroelectric power, plus jobs in building those dams, plus jobs in maintaining those dams, plus jobs in building the roads that go to those dams, plus jobs in stringing the power lines that came from those dams, and all of the tangential industries. An incredibly successful program. The WPA, this agency provided work for 8 million Americans. The WPA constructed or repaired schools, hospitals, airfields, etc. Also provided jobs for artists, and a huge amount of African Americans got jobs through the WPA. The WPA looked at artists as important workers. So the artists in the WPA built wonderful facades on public buildings. They built train stations around the United States that had artwork as part of them and gave them character. They had concerts in the park for musicians. So this idea of these summer concert series provided by local towns comes from the WPA. The Farm Security Administration. Well, we're going to help Zeke here. The FSA loaned more than $1 billion to farmers to set up camps for migrant workers. So Zeke was going to get some help from the government. The National Labor Relations Act, called the Wagner Act, it set labor standards and labor practices and said that workers can join unions. It's also called the Magna Carta or the Bill of Rights of Labor. Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, enacted by the United States Congress in 1938 to eliminate unsafe labor conditions. It outlawed child labor and adjusted the minimum wage. Social Security Act, granddaddy of them all here, it provides a pension system for old age workers who have now retired so they don't have to work until they die. Also provides money for disabled people so they're not out on the street. Also provides money for children who have lost one or both of their parents until they reach the age of majority. So as you can see, a lot of government programs. This is why some people say that Franklin Roosevelt was a socialist, because these are highly socialized programs. My reaction to that is, what's wrong with highly socialized programs if they help people? If they're helping society and our tax dollars are paying for them, what's wrong with all of this? I get the dependent idea. Any program can go too far. Any government initiative can go too far. We probably need a careful balance. A careful balance of individual initiative, the guy learning to fish, and government programs teaching people how to fish. And nevertheless, This is a broad look at Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. And you can understand one of the things we talked about earlier that is controversial. And did the New Deal actually work? Well, the people who benefited from the New Deal and the people who take a look at programs like Social Security and the Wagner Act say, yes, it definitely worked. There are other people that say, well, what really helped the economy come out of the Great Depression was World War II. There's something to be said for that as well, because that provided a lot of jobs. But who provided those jobs? World War II was the largest government jobs program in the history of the United States. So it's still the government providing those jobs. You can't get away from it. In the United States, in the modern world, the government and the economy are thoroughly intertwined. You see it very clearly with Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal. And these programs were popular, and Franklin Roosevelt was popular. Look, he was elected to 4 terms. In 1944, he was re-elected in declining health, and you can see the declining health. He still is re-elected. So he served through the Depression, and he served through World War II. It's hard to imagine a president having more on his plate than Franklin Roosevelt did. So for now, going to bid you farewell. We've taken a look at the Depression and government involvement in the Depression and Franklin Roosevelt's plan to get us out of the Depression. Topic 21 will be a close look at World War II and American involvement in World War II. So for Busch History, I'm David Busch. Remember, everything you see here can be found on the website www.buschhistory.net. Have a good day and take care. See you.